Everyone in the family froze when the mother played the recording hidden in her daughter's hair. She thought she was just worrying for nothing. But what came out of the speaker left her truly horrified. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Evenings in the house had once been filled with laughter, the gentle chatter of a child recounting the little triumphs and misfortunes of her school day, the sound of cutlery clinking as her mother prepared dinner, and the warmth of a routine that felt safe. Now there was silence. The quiet pressed in on the walls, heavy and unnatural, as if the house itself noticed the absence of that childlike energy. Her daughter would come home, push her shoes off without a word, and drift down the hallway into her room as though trying to disappear into the shadows. The mother noticed every detail because she remembered how it had been before. Her daughter, once bright and eager, used to spill stories before even setting her backpack down, about a silly mistake on the board, about a friend's drawing, about how she had been picked to read aloud. Now she said nothing. She picked at her dinner, her fork moving without appetite, her gaze lowered, her lips pressed tight. And when the meal was over, she would retreat quickly, shutting herself away with a swiftness that was both defensive and sad. At first, the mother told herself that it might be a passing phase. Children changed with the seasons. Sometimes they grew more private, sometimes more contemplative. She remembered her own childhood, the sudden waves of moods she could not explain to her own parents. Perhaps her daughter was simply growing. But as the days stretched into weeks, the changes deepened. The child's smile appeared less and less, and her laughter, once so free, seemed to have been locked away somewhere unreachable. One morning, as the girl sat at the breakfast table, her mother noticed the way her shoulders hunched forward. It was the posture of someone bracing against a storm, not a child preparing to face a classroom. She pushed the cereal around the bowl, eyes fixed on the pattern of the tablecloth, answering her mother's cheerful attempts at conversation with little more than a shrug or a nod. When the time came to leave, she lingered, tugging slowly at her shoes, as if hoping time itself might stop and spare her the day ahead. The mother, standing in the doorway, felt an unease coil tightly inside her. She began to pay closer attention. At night, she would hear her daughter shifting restlessly in her bed, sometimes whimpering softly, though never loud enough to call for comfort. The mother would stand outside the door, hand hovering near the handle, torn between wanting to step inside and fearing she might only add to the child's distress. She knew these signs, for she had once been a child who had dreaded school too, though for different reasons. She had faced the cruelty of peers, the sharp words of an impatient teacher, and she remembered the endless mornings when her stomach had ached from fear more than from hunger. To see her daughter showing the same symptoms cut into her like a blade. She tried gentle questions. "How was your day? Did anything special happen? Do you want to talk about it?" But the answers were vague, almost rehearsed. It was fine. Nothing happened. "I'm just tired." No child could be just tired every day. The mother's unease grew into suspicion. Something at school was wrong, something that her daughter would not or could not articulate. The turning point came one evening when the mother was tidying her daughter's room. Among the scattered notebooks and pencils, she found a page torn roughly from a spiral pad. The words on it, written in her daughter's uneven handwriting, froze her in place. "I'm scared of school." That single line, smudged where a hand had pressed too hard or perhaps where tears had fallen, confirmed what the mother had begun to fear. She sat on the edge of the bed holding the page, her mind spinning. Fear of school did not grow in a vacuum. It had a source, and it was her duty to uncover it. No reassurance, no dismissal of her instincts would suffice anymore. Whatever was happening within those classroom walls was slowly breaking her child. The silence at dinners, the restless nights, the reluctance each morning, these were not the moods of growing up. These were signals of distress. As she folded the page carefully and slipped it into her pocket, she felt both grief and resolve. Grief that her daughter had suffered quietly, and resolve that she would not allow it to continue. There was a storm brewing. She could sense it. But she also knew that a mother's love had its own kind of strength, the kind that refused to be silenced. The rest of that night passed in uneasy contemplation. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint rustle of her daughter turning in sleep. Every sound reminded her of the truth written on that piece of paper. She understood that from this moment forward, she could not simply wait for answers to surface. She would need to seek them out, to look beneath the surface, even if it meant crossing lines she had never imagined crossing before. The following morning, as the dawn light filtered into the kitchen, she watched her daughter move sluggishly, her little shoulders burdened with a weight invisible to the world but impossible to miss for a mother's eyes. The decision formed quietly, like a seed taken root. She would not stand aside. She would not let her daughter continue to suffer unseen. She might not yet know the exact shape of the problem, but she knew one thing with certainty. She was going to find out, no matter the cost. Her heart ached with love and fear as she kissed the girl on the head before sending her off to school. And as the child walked down the path, clutching her bag with hesitant steps, the mother remained by the door, staring after her with eyes that carried both sorrow and determination. The silence in the house, once painful, now became a promise that she would no longer ignore the signs. What began as troubling changes in her daughter's behavior had become something undeniable, something urgent. The mother's journey was only just beginning, though she did not yet know how far it would carry her, or how deeply it would shake the foundations of her trust in those entrusted with her child's care. What she did know was that she could not, would not, remain silent any longer. And as the evening shadows crept once more across the walls of the home, she felt the fragile page in her pocket, a confession written by a child's hand, burning like a beacon. It was not simply a note. It was a cry for help, a cry that demanded an answer. That night, the mother lay awake long after the house had fallen silent. The note in her pocket felt heavier than paper ought to be, as if it carried with it not only the weight of her child's fear, but also the responsibility of uncovering its cause. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her daughter's hunched shoulders at the breakfast table, the way her fork moved listlessly across her plate, the shadow that had replaced her once bright smile. Sleep refused to come. Instead, thoughts circled endlessly, and each thought sharpened into a conviction. She could not ignore this any longer. She tried to reason with herself, as anyone might in such circumstances. Perhaps she was overreacting. Children sometimes grew withdrawn without reason. Sometimes they fought with friends or struggled with lessons they were too embarrassed to mention. Yet, even as she tried to believe this, her heart rejected it. The memory of that line in shaky handwriting, "I'm scared of school," rose again and again, like a flame against the darkness. Whatever was happening went beyond ordinary childhood troubles. Her daughter was not just tired or shy, she was suffering. The mother turned onto her side and listened to the faint sounds of her child moving in the next room. The floor creaked softly, then fell silent again. She wondered if the girl was awake, staring into the shadows, waiting for morning with the same dread she herself felt. For a moment, she considered going to her, brushing the hair from her forehead, whispering promises that everything would be all right. But promises meant little if they could not be kept. The mother knew that words alone would not banish fear. She needed proof. She needed to know exactly what happened when her daughter stepped through the doors of that classroom. By the time dawn broke, her sleepless vigil had given way to a plan. It was a desperate idea, one that unsettled her even as it settled into her mind as the only option. If her daughter would not, or could not, tell her what was wrong, then she would have to see, or hear it for herself. And so, while the world outside turned from gray to gold, the mother found herself searching online, her tired eyes scanning articles and forums where other parents had shared similar stories. Again and again, she came across the same suggestion, whispered between lines of caution, a hidden recording device. It was not allowed in most schools, perhaps even illegal, but mothers and fathers had still resorted to it when left with no choice. Some had uncovered nothing, but others had found truths too bitter to be doubted. She resisted at first, appalled by the thought of deceiving her child or breaking the rules. But as she read the words of strangers who described how their children had been belittled, mocked, or frightened by those who were meant to teach them, her hesitation faded. It was not simply curiosity that pushed her, it was love. If rules existed that protected harm instead of exposing it, then those rules were wrong. And if trust in the system meant leaving her daughter to endure day after day of silent misery, then trust was a luxury she could not afford. The decision made her heart race, as though she were preparing to step onto forbidden ground. Later that morning, when she left the house under the pretense of running errands, she drove instead to a small electronics shop on the other side of town. Her hands trembled as she picked up the small packages, a tiny voice recorder no larger than her thumb, and a button-sized camera that could be clipped or hidden within fabric. The clerk barely glanced at her as he rang up the sale, but she felt exposed all the same, certain that every passerby could read her intentions. She tucked the bag deep into her purse and left quickly, the bell above the door jingling behind her like a sound of complicity. At home, when the girl was outside playing quietly in the yard, the mother spread the items on the kitchen table and examined them. They looked innocuous, even harmless. Yet in them she placed her trust, her hope that they would reveal the truth. She tested the recorder, speaking softly into it and then replaying her words. Clear as day, her voice filled the room. She tried the camera, too, pinning it discreetly beneath the collar of her shirt, checking in the mirror to see how easily it could vanish from sight. It was easy. Too easy, she thought grimly, for such secrets to be hidden. That evening, after dinner, she sat behind her daughter brushing her hair. It was a familiar ritual, one that usually comforted them both. But tonight the mother's hands moved with a different purpose. She divided the strands carefully, weaving them into neat, tight braids. As she worked, she found the perfect place to nestle the recorder, tucking it close to the scalp where it would be secure, threading hair over it until it was invisible. The camera she attached in a way that would catch at least part of the classroom scene, its lens small enough to be mistaken for nothing at all. Her heart pounded with guilt. She told herself she was betraying nothing, that the deception was not directed at her daughter, but at the silence that surrounded her. Still, as she looked at the innocent face in front of her, she felt as if she were balancing on a knife's edge between right and wrong. Would her child forgive her if she ever discovered the truth? Or would she see only that her mother had hidden something in her hair like a spy, treating her not as a daughter, but as an unwitting accomplice? When the braids were finished, the mother kissed the girl's forehead and sent her to bed. Then she sat alone in the living room, staring at the darkened window. The devices were ready, her resolve firm. But the unease in her chest remained, whispering of risks she could not ignore. If discovered, the recording might be dismissed as unlawful, the evidence invalid. Worse, the school might punish her daughter for something she had never asked to be part of. Yet, what was the alternative? To do nothing was to allow the fear to continue unchecked. The night stretched long once more, filled with her pacing footsteps and restless thoughts. She imagined all that might happen the following day. Her daughter sitting quietly at her desk, the camera watching, the recorder capturing voices. She imagined listening to the playback and hearing nothing but the normal buzz of a classroom. She imagined hearing something far worse. Either way, she would know. And knowing was better than this torment of guessing. By morning, her resolve had hardened. She helped her daughter dress, her fingers lingering on the braids, double-checking that the devices were still hidden, still secure. She smiled as she handed the child her backpack, hiding the tremor in her hands. The girl looked up at her with tired eyes, offering the faintest of smiles before stepping out the door. The mother watched her go, the weight of her choice pressing down with each step the child took away from her. As the door closed, silence fell again upon the house. But it was a different silence than before. This time it was filled not with helplessness, but with anticipation and dread. The mother sank into a chair, her mind racing ahead to the evening when her daughter would return, and she would finally hold the answers she had sought for so long. Whether those answers would bring relief or despair, she could not know. Only that the moment of truth was coming, and that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. She folded her arms on the table and pressed her forehead against them, exhausted yet unyielding. The decision was made, the path chosen. Whatever came of it, she would walk that path to the end. For in her heart there was no longer any room for hesitation. There was only the fierce certainty of a mother determined to uncover the truth, no matter how dark it might be. And as the sun rose higher, casting its light across the quiet home, she sat waiting, her thoughts fixed on the classroom where her daughter now sat, unaware that the secret woven into her hair carried with it both her mother's fear and her hope. The day seemed endless, as though time itself had conspired against the mother. The moment her daughter left for school with the secret woven into her hair, the walls of the house closed in around her. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the passing of cars outside, felt amplified, each one marking the unbearable slowness of the hours. She tried to distract herself with chores, scrubbing the kitchen counters until they shone, folding laundry with unnecessary precision, but her mind was not on her hands. Again and again, she pictured her daughter sitting in that classroom, head bowed over her desk, the tiny devices hidden, recording everything. She imagined voices rising, the scrape of chairs, the sound of books opening, and beneath it all, she imagined the harsh voice she feared she would hear later, the one that lived in her daughter's silence. As noon came and went, her anxiety grew sharper. She wondered what the recorder might be capturing at that very moment. Was it catching the sound of laughter and normal lessons, or was it documenting pain? She caught herself glancing at the clock every few minutes, each glance a reminder that time refused to move faster. At one point, she even considered driving to the school, standing outside like she had when her daughter first started kindergarten, just to feel closer. But she knew she had to wait. To interfere now would only risk everything. By the time the school day ended, her nerves were frayed thin. She stood by the window, watching for her daughter to appear on the sidewalk. When she finally saw her, the relief was so intense it left her dizzy. The girl trudged home the way she had for weeks, backpack hanging heavy, face blank of expression. Nothing seemed outwardly different. Yet the mother's pulse quickened, because hidden within those braids was the truth. She welcomed her daughter home with the same quiet warmth as always, pretending nothing was unusual. She asked about her day and received the familiar, muted replies. The girl drifted to her room after setting down her bag, and the mother let her, though every part of her longed to rush forward and retrieve what she had hidden. Instead, she waited until evening, until dinner was finished and the child was safely in bed. Then, heart pounding, she went to the small drawer where she had hidden the devices and carefully retrieved them. Her hands shook as she held the recorder, so small and innocent in appearance, yet containing hours of unseen reality. She sat at the kitchen table, lights dimmed, and pressed play. At first, there was only the expected soundscape of a classroom, the scrape of chairs, the rustle of paper, the indistinct murmur of children speaking. For a moment, she dared to hope that her fears had been wrong, that she would hear nothing more than the ordinary bustle of school life. But then it came. A voice, sharp and cutting, slicing through the noise like a whip. It was the teacher's voice, unmistakably adult, laced with irritation. "Too slow," it barked. "Why can't you pay attention?" The words came in quick succession, and with them the tone grew harder, angrier. The mother sat frozen, her breath caught in her chest as more followed. She heard the teacher mock a child's answer, dismiss their effort with cold sarcasm. She heard the chilling phrase, "Are you deaf?" thrown like a weapon. And then there was the sound that made her heart break completely. The stifled sobs of a child, barely audible, but present enough to tear her apart. She paused the recording, her hands pressed to her mouth, fighting the swell of rage and sorrow. This was not discipline, not firm guidance. This was cruelty. Her daughter, her little girl, had been forced to sit through this every day, her silence at home now fully explained. The mother felt tears sting her eyes, but she pressed play again, forcing herself to listen. She owed her daughter the truth, however painful it was to face. The recording continued with more of the same. The teacher's voice rose and fell, always with that same undercurrent of contempt. The children's responses grew quieter, hesitant, like voices shrinking away from harm. She could almost picture the scene, rows of small desks, children shifting uncomfortably, heads bowed, too afraid to speak above a whisper. It was not a classroom filled with learning. It was a place of fear. The longer she listened, the more her anger burned, until it felt like a living thing inside her chest. When the playback finally ended, she sat in silence, staring at the recorder as if it had become something alive, a witness to what had been hidden. Her hands trembled as she set it down. She thought of her daughter upstairs, asleep at last, oblivious to the fact that her secret had been uncovered. She thought of all the mornings when the girl had begged not to go, all the nights she had cried softly into her pillow. Now it all made sense, and the mother felt both relief and fury. Relief that she finally understood, fury that such harm had been allowed to go on unchecked. She replayed parts of the recording again, listening carefully, noting details she had missed. Each phrase, each insult, each moment of hostility struck her like a blow. It was worse than she had imagined, and yet it confirmed what her instincts had told her all along. Her daughter had not been exaggerating, had not been weak. She had been enduring something no child should face. The mother sat long into the night, weighing her next steps. She could not simply keep this knowledge to herself. Yet she also knew the risks. Schools had rules, boards had policies, and recordings made in secret were often dismissed or ignored. But how could she remain silent, knowing what she knew now? The question gnawed at her, tearing at the fragile peace of the house. At last she rose, moving quietly through the rooms, checking on her daughter as she slept. The girl's face was relaxed in slumber, the fear momentarily lifted. The mother brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and whispered silently, a vow that she would not let this continue. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, she would confront them. The truth was now in her hands, captured in sound, undeniable. It was both a burden and a weapon, and she knew she would need both courage and resolve to wield it. As she returned to her own bed, exhaustion pressing down, she felt the weight of what was to come. This was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring the first step into a battle she had not sought but could no longer avoid, and as sleep finally crept over her, she clutched the recorder tightly, as though by holding it she could hold on to the strength she would need. For she understood now with unshakable clarity. The days of silence were over. The truth had been revealed, and it demanded to be acted upon. The morning after listening to the recording, the mother awoke with a heaviness she could not shake. Sleep had come late and brought little rest, for the teacher's voice still echoed in her mind. The cruel words, the biting tone, the muffled sobs of children replayed themselves as though they had carved themselves into her memory. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, before finally rising to face a day that no longer felt ordinary. The recorder sat on her nightstand, a small object containing a truth too large to ignore. At breakfast, her daughter sat quietly, spoon moving lazily through her cereal, her eyes downcast as always. The mother tried to speak lightly, to keep the weight of her discovery hidden, but every glance at the child made her chest ache with sorrow. She knew the girl was living with a burden far too heavy for such young shoulders, and that knowledge left her both furious and determined. As she watched her daughter put on her shoes and prepare for another day in that classroom, her resolve solidified. This could not continue. Something had to be done. Once the girl left, the mother picked up the phone and called her husband at work. Her voice trembled as she explained what she had found, how she had spent hours listening to the evidence. When he came home that evening, she played the recording for him. He sat at the table with his hands folded tightly together, his brow furrowed deeper with each passing moment. At first, he said nothing, only listening. But when the words of the teacher cut through again, sharp, belittling, filled with disdain, his expression hardened. When the playback ended, he leaned back heavily in his chair, his jaw set. The silence between them was filled with a shared understanding. Their child had been subjected to cruelty, and they could not remain passive. But the question lingered. What now? The mother felt both empowered by the truth and trapped by it. She had the evidence, yet she knew the rules. Secret recordings were rarely welcomed, often dismissed as invalid. And still, she could not allow this to remain hidden. She thought of the other children in that classroom, children whose parents perhaps had no idea what was happening. Their silence might mean their sons and daughters suffered as her own had. It was not only her daughter's battle now, but a responsibility to them all. The following morning, she gathered her courage and went to the school. Her husband joined her, his face grim with determination. Together, they carried the recorder, wrapped in a small cloth as though it were something fragile. They were led into the office of the principal, a neatly dressed man with kind but guarded eyes. The mother explained what had happened, her voice steady though her hands trembled. She spoke of the changes in her daughter, of the note she had found, and at last she produced the recorder. When the principal pressed play, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The teacher's voice filled the office, harsh and unrelenting, a sound that seemed entirely out of place in the quiet space. The principal listened without interrupting, but his expression remained unreadable. When the playback ended, he exhaled slowly and placed the device on the desk. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. The mother waited, expecting outrage, sympathy, perhaps even immediate action. Instead, the principal's words fell like a cold wind. He acknowledged that the language was harsh, perhaps unacceptable, but reminded them that the recording itself had been obtained against school policy. There were rules about privacy, he explained, rules that could not be overlooked. The mother's heart sank as she listened. To her, the issue was simple. Children were being harmed, but to the administration the matter seemed tangled in bureaucracy, a question of legality rather than morality. They offered her a solution, though it felt more like a dismissal. Her daughter could be moved to another class, away from that teacher, ensuring her safety. But the teacher herself would remain, perhaps with a reminder to adjust her tone, perhaps with a note in her file. Nothing more. The mother's chest tightened with disbelief. This was not justice. This was avoidance. She left the office with her husband, her steps unsteady, her emotions raw. Outside, the air was bright and warm, but it felt like a mockery. She clutched the recorder in her hand, now more precious than ever, though its power had been dismissed. Her husband placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, but she could see in his eyes the same frustration that burned within her. Their daughter might be safe if transferred, yes, but what of the other children? What of the principle that no teacher should be allowed to belittle and frighten those in their care? That evening, the couple spoke in hushed voices while their daughter slept. They weighed the relief of having her moved against the bitterness of knowing the problem had not been solved. The mother felt a gnawing dissatisfaction, a restlessness that left her pacing the room. She could not shake the image of other children sitting at their desks, shrinking under the weight of that same angry voice, feeling the same fear her daughter had felt. She realized then that this was not over. The first step had been taken, confronting the school, presenting the evidence, but it was only the beginning. If the administration would not act, then she would have to find another way. The thought frightened her, for it meant stepping beyond the walls of the school into a battle that might draw the attention of strangers, of the wider community. Yet, even as fear rose, determination overshadowed it. Her child's happiness, her child's dignity, demanded nothing less. That night, she lay awake once more, staring at the ceiling, the faint sound of her daughter's breathing drifting from the next room. She thought about the voices on the recording, about the contempt threaded through them. She thought about the blank face her daughter wore each day after school, and she thought about the principal's calm dismissal, his emphasis on policy over pain. The anger inside her hardened into something steadier, something immovable. She would not stop here. She could not. The truth was on her side, and though the system might resist, She believed that other parents, other hearts, would understand. The decision she had made to record had been the first step. Now she would have to take the next, into a wider arena where silence would no longer protect those who caused harm. And so, as the house fell into deep night, the mother made another vow to herself. She would not let this fade into obscurity, not let her daughter's fear be brushed aside as an inconvenience. The truth had been revealed, and though the first step had left her bruised with disappointment, it had also lit the fire that would guide her forward. The path was uncertain, perhaps dangerous, but it was one she would walk without hesitation. For a mother's love does not falter when faced with resistance. It sharpens, hardens, and presses on. And hers was a love that would not be silenced. The days that followed the meeting with the principal felt heavy and unreal, as though the mother were moving through a world dulled by disappointment. She had gone into that office with the recorder in her hands and fire in her heart, convinced that the truth, once spoken aloud, would compel action. Yet, what she had met instead was the cool indifference of rules and policy, the careful tones of a man who seemed more concerned with protecting the image of the school than with protecting the children who sat in its classrooms. The offer to transfer her daughter had given her some relief, but it was not justice, and every time she thought of the other students left behind under the same cruel voice, her stomach tightened with anger. Her daughter, at least, seemed calmer in the days after the meeting, as if the mother's promise of change had lifted some of the weight from her small shoulders. But the mother could not rest. Each night she lay awake, listening to the silence of the house, her mind circling back to the same point. She had proof. She had evidence of cruelty. And yet it had been dismissed. If the institution refused to act, then the responsibility to bring the truth into the light fell squarely on her shoulders. She considered her options carefully. Speaking out would mean exposure. It would mean placing herself and her family in the center of something that could no longer be contained within the walls of the school. It could bring criticism, perhaps even retaliation. But to remain silent would mean allowing the cycle to continue, leaving other children to suffer as her daughter had. That thought alone was unbearable. The choice was not truly a choice at all. On a quiet evening, after her daughter had gone to bed, she sat at the dining table with her husband. The recorder lay between them, a silent witness to their deliberation. She spoke of her fears, of what might happen if they went public, of the judgment they might face, of the possibility that nothing might change. He listened, his brow furrowed, his hands clasped tightly. Then he spoke with quiet certainty, reminding her that their child had already lived in fear long enough and that they could not allow others to endure the same. Together they decided. The truth had to be shared. The mother began by writing down their story. She described the changes in her daughter, the sleepless nights, the note she had found. She wrote about the desperate choice to hide a recorder, the shock of what she had heard, and the cold response from the school. Her words poured out with a mixture of grief and fury, each sentence a plea for others to understand. When she was done, she read it over and felt her hands tremble, for now their private pain had been given a public voice. She posted the account online, attaching fragments of the recording. Her finger hovered over the button for a long moment before she pressed it, and when she did, her heart pounded with both dread and relief. The truth was no longer locked inside her home. It was out in the world, free to be seen, to be judged, to be shared. At first, there was silence. The post gathered a handful of reactions, a few sympathetic comments, and for a moment she feared that it would vanish into the endless tide of voices that filled the internet each day. But then, slowly, it began to spread. One parent shared it, then another. Friends passed it along, and soon strangers were commenting, their words filled with shock and anger. Some told her that they had heard stories of similar behavior from teachers, that her account gave them courage to speak of their own. Others thanked her for her bravery, for shining a light on what was too often hidden. Within days, the post had reached far beyond what she had expected. Hundreds of comments appeared, then thousands. Local community groups began to share it, and news outlets reached out, asking for permission to use her story. The mother felt a mixture of pride and fear as she watched the numbers climb. It was no longer just her voice. It was becoming a chorus. Then came the messages from other parents in her own town, from mothers and fathers whose children had sat in the same classroom. They wrote that their sons and daughters had also come home withdrawn, that they too had complained of being shouted at, belittled, even mocked. Many admitted they had not believed their children at first, chalking it up to sensitivity or childish exaggeration. But hearing the recording, seeing her courage, they realized the truth. Their guilt mingled with gratitude, and they urged her not to stop, not to let the matter be swept aside. The mother began to organize. She created a group for the parents who reached out, a place where they could share their experiences and decide on action together. The stories poured in, each one a piece of a puzzle that revealed a pattern too clear to deny. This was not a single bad day, not a moment of stress misunderstood. It was a culture of fear created by the one person who should have been nurturing growth and learning. The weight of those voices strengthened her resolve. She was no longer standing alone. The pressure began to build. Local newspapers picked up the story, quoting from the Post, embedding parts of the recording. The image of the quiet classroom filled with cruel words spread across the community. People debated in grocery stores, in church halls, at playgrounds. Some defended the teacher, arguing that classrooms were difficult and discipline was necessary, but far more condemned what they had heard. The phrase, "Are you deaf?" became a rallying cry, a symbol of the disregard for children's dignity that could not be excused. With the growing attention came fear as well. The mother worried for her daughter, worried that being the focus of so much scrutiny might bring harm. She and her husband spoke carefully with the girl, explaining in gentle terms that they were fighting to make school a safe place not only for her, but for everyone. The child, though young, seemed to understand. She looked at her mother with trust, and that look alone was enough to keep the mother steady through her own doubts. Every day the chorus of voices grew louder. Parents who had remained silent for years now spoke, emboldened by the knowledge that they were not alone. Together they began drafting a petition, demanding the removal of the teacher from the classroom. Signatures flooded in, first by the dozens, then by the hundreds, until the numbers reached into the thousands. The mother watched with awe as names filled the list, each one a person standing with her, each one proof that the truth could not be contained. And yet, in the quiet moments when the house was still, she felt the weight of what was happening. They had ignited a fire that could not be easily controlled. The school board would be forced to respond, but what form that response would take remained uncertain. She knew enough of institutions to understand that they often protected themselves first, but she also knew that silence had been shattered, and that was a victory no one could take away. As the petition grew and the voices multiplied, the mother sensed that the path ahead would not be easy, but she no longer felt the despair that had once haunted her nights. Instead, there was a fierce clarity. She had taken the truth from the shadows and carried it into the light. And now it belonged to all who had suffered, to all who refused to accept fear as a part of childhood. The fight had begun, and it was no longer hers alone. It belonged to a community awakened, to parents who would no longer be ignored, to children who deserved to be heard. And in that growing chorus, the mother felt for the first time that real change might be possible. The petition spread faster than the mother could have imagined. What had begun as a desperate attempt to be heard became a wave that rolled through the community, gathering momentum with every passing day. By the end of the week, thousands of signatures had filled the digital pages, each one representing a voice unwilling to remain silent. Parents who had once whispered their concerns now stood openly, demanding that the board address what was happening inside the classroom. The mother found herself at the center of it all, her story quoted in newspapers, her voice replayed in radio interviews, her words shared and reshared across social media platforms. What had once been private pain was now public outcry. At first, the attention felt overwhelming. She had not set out to be a leader or a spokesperson, only a mother trying to protect her daughter. Yet, as calls and messages poured in, she realized that people were looking to her for guidance. Other parents told her that they had been too afraid to speak, that they had dismissed their children's complaints, but her actions had given them courage. She carried the weight of their trust with equal parts pride and dread. There was no going back now. The school board could not ignore the storm forever. Within days, an announcement was made. A special public meeting would be held to address the growing concerns. The mother's heart pounded when she read the notice, for it meant that their voices had forced the administration's hand. But it also meant that the confrontation she had both longed for and feared was at last upon her. The night of the meeting, the auditorium filled beyond capacity. Parents crowded into the seats, others stood along the walls, some spilling into the hallway outside. The air buzzed with restless energy, a mixture of anger, frustration, and hope. Local reporters sat with notebooks ready, cameras flashing occasionally as they captured the faces of those gathered. The mother sat near the front with her husband beside her, clutching the folded petition in her hands. She felt the heat of so many eyes, the hum of voices blending into a single pulse of expectation. When the board members entered, a hush fell over the room. They took their places behind the long table at the front, their expressions composed, their posture carefully measured. The chairperson, a stern-looking woman with steel-gray hair, called the meeting to order. Her voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed, but tonight that authority trembled against the sheer volume of discontent in the room. One by one, parents rose to speak. Their voices cracked with emotion as they described their children's experiences. The tears after school, the reluctance to attend, the fear that had taken root where curiosity should have flourished. Some spoke of specific incidents, repeating words nearly identical to those captured in the recording. Others confessed their guilt for not listening sooner. Each testimony added weight to the case against the teacher, weaving together a tapestry of pain too vast to dismiss. When her turn came, the mother rose slowly, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She unfolded the petition and placed it on the table before the board, a stack of signatures thick with the will of the community. She spoke of her daughter, of the changes she had witnessed, of the night she found the note that said simply, "I'm scared of school." Her voice trembled as she described the decision to hide a recorder, the horror of what she heard, and the dismissal she received from the administration. She told them that moving one child to another class was not justice, that it did nothing for the dozens left behind. She told them that children were not fragile glass to be shouted into submission, but human beings who deserved dignity and respect. The room erupted in applause and murmurs of agreement. For a moment, she felt the power of unity, the strength of voices joined together. She looked out over the crowd and saw parents nodding, tears glistening, faces set with determination. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that change might truly come. But the board was not so easily swayed. After hours of testimony, the chairperson thanked the parents for their passion and assured them that their concerns had been heard. The board then retreated into closed discussion. The wait-in was agony. Parents clustered in groups, speaking in urgent whispers, while reporters jotted notes and speculated aloud. The mother sat with her hands clasped tightly, praying that the weight of evidence and the roar of the community would break through the shield of bureaucracy. When the board returned, the atmosphere shifted. The chairperson's face was unreadable as she announced the decision. The teacher would not be dismissed. Instead, she would receive an official warning and mandatory training on classroom conduct. The words fell heavy in the room, like stones dropped into water. At first, there was stunned silence, followed swiftly by shouts of protest. Parents rose from their seats, voices raised in anger, demanding to know how thousands of signatures, hours of testimony, and undeniable evidence could result in so little. The mother sat frozen, her breath caught in her chest. She felt the air drain from her lungs as the truth of the board's decision sank in. They had chosen to protect one of their own, to preserve the system rather than confront its flaws. All the nights of fear, all the tears shed by children, all the courage it had taken to speak out, reduced to a warning. It was not justice. It was a gesture, a bandage placed over a wound that still bled beneath. Her husband touched her arm gently, grounding her as the room erupted in chaos. She heard parents shouting, reporters firing questions, the chairperson trying to restore order. But her mind was far away, drifting to the image of her daughter in her new classroom, safe for now, smiling again. That was her one solace. Her child would no longer face the cruelty that had once silenced her. Yet the thought of the other children still trapped in that classroom made her stomach twist with anguish. When the meeting finally adjourned, the mother stepped outside into the cool night air. The crowd spilled into the parking lot, buzzing with frustration and disbelief. Some vowed to keep fighting. Others despaired that nothing more could be done. She stood among them, the petition still clutched in her hand, feeling the weight of disappointment pressing hard against her chest. And yet, beneath the sorrow, a quieter truth stirred. They had not been silenced. The story was out. The voices had been heard, and the community had awakened. Though the board's decision had fallen short, something irreversible had begun. Parents would not forget. Children would not remain invisible, and the fight for respect and justice would not fade simply because the first battle had ended in compromise. As she looked up at the stars above, the mother felt the familiar fire rekindle within her. The board might believe the matter closed, but she knew better. Change was not a single meeting, not a single decision. Change was persistence, the refusal to let truth be buried. Her daughter's laughter had returned to their home, and that alone made every step worth it. But the road ahead stretched further, and she would walk it with the same fierce love that had carried her this far. The night wrapped around her like a cloak, cool and unyielding, but within her burned the steady flame of resolve. The board's verdict had not ended the fight. It had only shown how much more remained to be done. The morning after the board's decision, the house felt different. Though the mother's heart was heavy with disappointment, there was also a quiet sense of relief because her daughter no longer had to sit in that hostile classroom. She prepared breakfast slowly, her mind still echoing with the sounds of the crowded meeting, the raised voices of parents, the cold announcement from the board. Yet, when her daughter came into the kitchen, there was a brightness in her eyes the mother had not seen in a long time. The girl sat down and began to chatter about her new class, about how the desks were arranged differently, about the kind smile of the teacher who had welcomed her. For the first time in months, her words spilled out naturally, unforced, filling the air with the simple music of childhood. The mother listened with tears gathering in her eyes. It was as if a weight had been lifted from the small shoulders that had once drooped with fear. The child laughed at her own stories, described the games she had played with classmates, and even asked to stay longer after school to work on a project. These were ordinary things, yet to the mother they felt extraordinary, proof that the shadow hanging over her daughter's life had begun to fade. At dinner that evening, the family sat together and laughed, the conversation flowing easily, the house once again alive with warmth. The father smiled more freely too, the deep furrow of worry that had carved into his brow beginning to soften. Still, for the mother, the sense of victory was incomplete. Each joyful glance at her daughter reminded her of the children left behind. She imagined them still sitting under the sharp gaze of a teacher who had not been truly held accountable, still shrinking from the harsh tone that had made her own child silent. That thought pressed against her joy like a stone in her chest. She knew she could not stop now. Her daughter was safe, yes, but the larger fight remained. In the weeks that followed, she began to turn her attention outward. The parents she had spoken with at the meeting remained in touch, their voices no less passionate despite the board's disappointing verdict. Together, they met in living rooms and coffee shops, talking late into the night about what could be done. Some wanted to appeal the decision, others to take their concerns to higher authorities. Many simply wanted to ensure that no other family would ever endure what they had. From these conversations, something new began to form. Not just outrage, but a community united by a common goal. The mother felt herself changing too. Where once she had been hesitant, uncertain of her own strength, she now spoke with a clarity that surprised even her. She no longer stumbled over her words when reporters called. She no longer doubted whether her actions were justified. She had faced the truth, carried it into the light, and found that her voice had power. That realization brought with it a new sense of responsibility. If she had the strength to fight, then she owed it not only to her daughter, but to every child still sitting in silence. Her daughter flourished in her new environment. The girl's grades improved, her smile returned, and her laughter rang through the house once more. She began to bring friends home, filling the living room with their games and laughter. The mother watched quietly from the kitchen doorway, grateful that her child's innocence had not been completely stolen, that joy could be restored even after fear. Each evening, as she tucked her daughter into bed, she saw lightness in her eyes, a trust that had been absent for too long. And though the memory of the darker days remained, they no longer defined her. The mother's resolve deepened with each passing day. She began drafting proposals with the parent group, ideas for new policies that would hold teachers accountable, for stronger systems of oversight, for ways to ensure that children had safe avenues to speak when they were mistreated. She wrote letters to local officials, reached out to advocacy organizations, and spoke at community gatherings. What had once been a single battle for her daughter's safety had become a broader mission, one that gave her life a new sense of direction. She knew that change would not come quickly. Institutions resisted, boards deflected, and those in power often protected their own. But she also knew that persistence mattered. The voices of parents, once scattered and uncertain, were now growing stronger together. And she believed deeply that no matter how slow the process, the truth had been set free and could no longer be buried. Her husband supported her fully, standing by her side at meetings, listening patiently as she rehearsed speeches, holding her hand when doubt crept in. He too understood that their family had been thrust into something larger than themselves, and he met it with the quiet strength that had always steadied her. Their daughter, though unaware of the full scope of her mother's work, sensed the shift as well. She knew her parents were fighting not only for her, but for others, and in her innocent way she seemed proud, often saying that her new teacher told her she was brave. One evening, months after the recording had first been played at their kitchen table, the mother sat alone in the quiet house. Her daughter was asleep, her husband reading upstairs. She held the recorder in her hands again, the small device that had changed everything. She thought of the fear that had driven her to use it, the courage it had demanded, the storm it had unleashed. It was a reminder of how far they had come and of how much remained to be done. She placed it back in its drawer with a sense of reverence, not as a symbol of defeat, but as the first tool in a fight that was still unfolding. She understood now that justice was not a single moment, not a swift verdict delivered by those in authority. Justice was built through persistence, through the courage to speak again and again until silence was no longer possible. As she stood by the window, looking out into the night, she felt a sense of peace she had not known in many months. Her daughter was safe, her family strong, and the path ahead clear. There would be setbacks, there would be resistance, but there would also be hope. And hope, she realized, was stronger than fear. The story that had begun with a child's silence had grown into a movement, and though the mother could not yet see its end, she knew she would walk its length. Not for recognition, not for glory, but for the simple truth that no child should ever sit in fear when they should be learning, laughing, and growing. That truth alone was enough to carry her forward, and so she closed her eyes and let the night embrace her, no longer haunted by helplessness, but guided by determination. What had started as one mother's decision had become a call for change, and she would follow it wherever it led. For her daughter's laughter, for the dignity of every child, for the belief that even in a flawed world, love could carve a path toward justice. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe now so you never miss another story. Watch our other videos for even more shocking and emotional true events. And share this video with your friends so they can see it too. The next twist might be even bigger than this one.